On October 5th, 1960, inside the deepest, most secure room in North America, a warning siren ripped through the underground halls of NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain Complex, bouncing off steel blast doors and echoing across the dim red-lit command floor as stunned operators stared at their screens in disbelief. America's early warning systems were reporting that hundreds of Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles had just launched and were now arcing over the polar ice toward the United States. Arrival time barely 15 minutes. And for the men in that room, officers, analysts, radar technicians, and communication specialists, there was no drill scheduled, no exercise underway, nothing that would justify this blaring alarm. And as adrenaline spiked, the computers feeding data to NORAD continued to paint the same horrifying picture. A massive nuclear first strike from the Soviet Union was already in progress. Even the most experienced Cold War veterans in the room felt their stomachs drop because everyone in that era understood one thing. The Soviet Union would never launch just a few missiles. If they struck, they would try to decapitate the United States in one overwhelming barrage aimed at obliterating America's bomber bases, missile silos, command centers, and major cities before a counterattack could be organized. And, according to the machines, that nightmare scenario had already begun. The commander on duty, Air Force General Lawrence Cooter, rushed to the center console where a cluster of officers were frantically verifying radar readings, cross-checking satellite feeds, and calling up the Strategic Air Command alert lines. The room was tense, too quiet. The only sounds the alarms and the frantic clicking of keyboards as the massive early warning screens dominating the front wall displayed wave after wave of what the system interpreted as incoming Soviet missiles rising from over the horizon near Siberia. Cooter's voice cut through the chaos as he demanded confirmation. Is this real? Is this verified by more than one system? Has anyone checked the BMEWS feed? Referencing the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System. America's newest, most sophisticated defense network, designed to detect Soviet nuclear launches from the Arctic moments later, a young technician shouted that the signal appeared to be coming from the brand new radar site in Thule, Greenland, a billion-dollar state-of-the-art installation built specifically to track missile trajectories with near-perfect accuracy, and that the system was reporting a massive formation rising just below the horizon, exactly where a Soviet strike would originate if Moscow ever decided to end the world. This was the nightmare scenario every Cold War planner feared, an attack detected not by one radar, not by one glitch, but by the most advanced and strategically positioned system the United States had ever created. And Cooter knew that if the missiles were real, he had mere minutes to advise the president to authorize a counterstrike. Failing to do so would risk America's entire nuclear arsenal being destroyed on the ground, leaving the nation helpless. As phones rang and coded emergency binders slammed open, several officers scrambled to initiate the fail-safe protocols linking NORAD to the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska, where General Thomas Power, a man so aggressive and terrifyingly eager for nuclear retaliation that some members of Congress privately feared him more than the Soviets, awaited confirmation for whether to put America's nuclear triad on full launch readiness. The tension escalated as senior analysts reported that the radar signal was strong, stable, and not flickering like a typical false alarm. The energy signature was massive, spread across a huge section of the sky, and the computer systems were labeling it as a large-scale missile launch with frightening confidence. The entire American early warning network had been constructed to prevent exactly this moment from being a surprise. And yet, despite all the layers of redundancy, all the filters, all the cross-checks, the data coming from Thule was undeniable. Something enormous was rising over the curvature of the Earth at high velocity, and the computer interpreted its radar cross-section as hundreds of Soviet missiles closing fast. And yet, something felt wrong. The Soviets were brutal, but they were not stupid. A first strike would be carefully timed, synchronized, and would begin with obvious signs of military preparation, scrambled aircraft, unusual submarine activity, coded radio traffic, or at least some sort of heightened tension. But that day had been unusually quiet. No intelligence warnings, no unusual movements, no intercepted communication indicating war. And that made Cooter hesitate. Rhythm matters in war. Missile launches do not appear out of nowhere during a calm week. So he demanded cross-verification from additional radar stations and from the brand new early warning satellite system the U.S. was experimenting with. The response came back chilling. No other radar in America was detecting any Soviet launches. Only Thule was. That contradiction made the room even more tense. Was Thule broken? Impossible. It was practically brand new. Was it being jammed? Unlikely. Jamming signals look chaotic, but this was crisp and consistent. Was the Soviet Union using a missile type so new that the U.S. had no profile for it? Maybe, but the scale was too big, too overwhelming. Something didn't add up. Then one analyst noticed something odd. The radar cross-sections were enormous, far larger than any Soviet missile. A single ICBM was about the size of a school bus. These readings indicated something the size of a mountain, and that's when he made the connection that froze him in place. He rushed to General Cooter's side and said the words that would later be remembered as the phrase that prevented World War III. "Sir, I think the system is picking up the moon." The room went silent. For a moment, nobody moved. The moon. The idea sounded absurd, yet the analyst quickly pulled up the astronomical charts and realized that on that exact day, at that exact moment, the moon was rising over the horizon in the exact direction and angle that the radar beam was sweeping across. And because Thule's radar was so powerful, so sensitive, and so new, it had never been calibrated to distinguish between a celestial body and an incoming wave of ballistic missiles. The moon, Earth's harmless, natural satellite, had appeared to the billion-dollar radar installation as an enemy attack. The technicians confirmed the theory in seconds. The timing matched, the angle matched, the velocity and size interpretation matched. The radar was literally seeing the curved surface of the moon, reflecting its signal back as one enormous radar return. And the computer, simple, rigid, designed for war, did what it was programmed to do. Interpret any massive rising object as a saturation missile strike. The attack was nothing more than a false reading caused by the moon's unexpected position relative to Thule's new scanning pattern. But here was the terrifying part. The system had come seconds away from triggering America's nuclear retaliation protocols. If the moon had risen a few degrees differently, if a few officers had been less cautious, if a single general had panicked, the United States might have launched thousands of nuclear warheads at the Soviet Union based on a misinterpreted radar signal. And if that had happened, Moscow would have responded instantly with their own arsenal. And civilization as we know it would have ended not because of a real attack, not because of hostile intent, but because a radar system mistook the moon for missiles. This single moment exposed a horrifying truth that military planners had feared for years. The early warning systems America relied on to prevent annihilation were far more fragile, unpredictable, and prone to catastrophic misinterpretation than anyone wanted to admit. And perhaps even worse, neither the president nor the public would learn about this false alarm for decades. What it revealed behind closed doors shook American commanders to their core, because if the moon could almost start World War III, what else could? In the hours following the false alarm, NORAD's senior leadership quietly initiated one of the most urgent internal investigations of the entire Cold War, a top-secret crash analysis meant to answer a single terrifying question. How had a system built at the cost of billions, a system sold to Congress as nearly infallible, come within minutes of triggering irreversible nuclear war, and as engineers, officers, physicists, and radar specialists crowded into briefing rooms still buzzing with residual adrenaline? One truth became impossible to ignore. The entire early warning doctrine the United States depended on had been built on a dangerously fragile assumption. that machines would not make catastrophic mistakes, that computers treated data objectively, that radar always saw reality. And yet the moon incident proved the opposite, because for several long minutes, the most advanced detection system in the world had behaved like a blind, panicked animal, screaming that the sky was falling simply because it didn't understand what it was looking at. As investigators began dissecting the event in painstaking detail, they realized something even more disturbing. The false alarm wasn't solely caused by the moon. It was caused by the combination of the moon's rising angle, a software oversight, a calibration error, and the rigid war-focused logic of the computer systems themselves. Under standard operating conditions, the Thule radar sent out massive pulses of energy that bounced off anything in their path and returned as data points. And the computer interpreted those points according to pre-programmed missile signatures, always assuming the worst because military doctrine demanded that false positives were safer than false negatives. In other words, the system was intentionally biased toward detecting an attack even when the data was ambiguous, because hesitation could mean annihilation. One engineer going over the radar logs noticed that the intensity of the return signal was far too large to match actual missile warheads. Each ICBM carried multiple re-entry vehicles, tiny compared to the moon. But the computer interpreted the moon's curved horizon as dozens, then hundreds, then potentially thousands of missile signatures merging at the same time. And because the software wasn't designed to identify celestial bodies, the system simply flagged them as an overwhelming nuclear barrage. Investigators also discovered that the Thule installation had been rushed into operational status due to heightened Cold War tensions. And while its hardware was state-of-the-art, its software still contained incomplete threat filters, meaning it was capable of categorizing radar echoes, but not yet capable of eliminating impossible ones. And the moon, a 2,000-mile-wide sphere, should have been eliminated instantly as a non-threat. Engineers were stunned that nobody had predicted this scenario, but the biggest shock came when analysts realized that the exact same false alarm could have happened at multiple other radar sites. Not just Thule, because the Cold War early warning network was built on identical assumptions and identical software systems with identical blind spots. In short, the moon incident wasn't a freak event. It was a symptom of a much larger and far more dangerous flaw in the architecture of global nuclear deterrence. Meanwhile, outside the secure rooms where technicians huddled over classified printouts, the Strategic Air Command was quietly repositioning its forces, ordering bombers already in the air back to more flexible formations, suspending certain drills and initiating mid-level readiness increases to ensure that if anything else went wrong, if the Soviets misinterpreted increased American communication traffic as an act of war, the U.S. military would not accidentally escalate the situation even further. General Thomas Power, head of SAC and infamous for his no-nonsense, borderline fanatical approach to nuclear readiness, demanded hourly updates and reportedly snapped at subordinates who suggested the moon explanation was sufficient closure. Power believed that any system capable of misreading the moon as a nuclear attack could misread almost anything, and he wasn't wrong. Later analysis would show that weather anomalies, satellite glitches, solar flares, atmospheric reflections, and even flocks of birds had triggered false alarms in the past, though none had come close to producing a warning as severe as the one caused by the moon. But what terrified analysts most wasn't the radar glitch. It was how fast the entire structure of American nuclear response had moved toward activation. When the alarm sounded, SAC's airborne alert bombers had immediately begun receiving encrypted messages, preparing them for possible strike authorization. Missile crews in underground silos were logging into readiness codes. Communication lines between NORAD and the Pentagon were spiking with urgent traffic. And within only a few minutes, multiple layers of America's deterrent triad had already begun sliding toward launch posture. All from a single radar return that nobody questioned until an analyst noticed the size mismatch. The terrifying truth was that the false alarm had exposed a vulnerability far more dangerous than anybody expected. The U.S. nuclear command system had no meaningful pause button once an alarm began cascading. It was a machine built to respond instantly, aggressively, and overwhelmingly, because Cold War planning assumed that in a real Soviet first strike, every second counted and hesitation could mean losing the entire country. And yet, as the moon incident demonstrated, reacting instantly to flawed data could end the world just as easily as reacting slowly to real data. Privately, multiple high-ranking officials admitted this scared them more than the Soviet Union itself, because the greatest threat wasn't always enemy missiles, but the hair trigger system meant to detect them. As the investigation continued, new layers of problems emerged. The Thule radar had been positioned in such a way that during certain times of the year, the moon rose in nearly perfect alignment with its main scanning beam, and the Earth's curvature meant that the radar would only see the moon once it passed a specific angle, exactly the same angle Soviet ICBMs would reach if they were launched from Siberia. In other words, the moon didn't just accidentally appear like a missile launch. It appeared exactly like the beginning of a Soviet nuclear strike, according to the geometry of the radar. Further analysis revealed another chilling detail. If the alarm had occurred during a period of heightened geopolitical tension, such as during the Berlin crisis or Cuban Missile Crisis, the response would have been far more aggressive, and the hesitation shown by General Cooter might not have happened. In fact, several senior military leaders later admitted that if the moon incident had happened just 2 years later, in 1962, during the height of nuclear paranoia, the U.S. might have launched retaliatory nuclear forces before the mistake was caught. Investigators also discovered that during the initial alarm, some commanders had already been pushing for SAC to move to full airborne readiness, a step that would have sent dozens of nuclear-armed bombers into the sky, where they would circle for hours awaiting either a stand-down order or a launch directive, and once airborne, the risk of accidental war skyrocketed because airborne bombers on nuclear alert had strict engagement rules and almost no margin for miscommunication. One former SAC officer later recalled that once the bombers were in the air, the world became significantly more dangerous because pilots had pre-planned targets and were authorized to carry out nuclear strikes if both communication and command were severed. In other words, one radar glitch followed by one communication failure could have been enough to unleash global nuclear devastation. And still, the most frightening realization came from the fact that neither the President nor the National Security Council had been informed at the moment the false alarm occurred. The system was built so that only once multiple levels of verification were completed would the President be brought into the chain, meaning that in a real attack scenario that moved too quickly for human verification, nuclear forces might launch before the commander-in-chief even knew what was happening. The moon incident revealed that the speed of nuclear war had surpassed the speed of political decision-making, and that machines interpreting the sky controlled the fate of the Earth more than elected leaders did. As NORAD's final report circulated through classified channels, one conclusion echoed through every page. The most dangerous period of the Cold War was not defined by Soviet aggression, but by the United States' own vulnerability to false data, flawed sensors, and the terrifying automated logic of nuclear early warning systems that could turn a harmless celestial body into the spark of Armageddon. In the days after the moon incident, while the official investigation quietly continued behind sealed doors and classified memos, panic began to rise among a select group of top scientists and defense analysts who understood what the event truly signaled: that the United States had built a nuclear strike detection network so sensitive and so fast that it no longer depended on human judgment, and in doing so had created a situation where civilization's survival hinged on whether a radar beam happened to reflect off the wrong object at the wrong moment. And nowhere was this fear more intense than inside the offices of ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, where mathematicians, physicists, and computer scientists were attempting to design next-generation warning systems that would eliminate false alarms forever, a task they now realize bordered on impossible because the universe itself was full of objects, reflections, anomalies, and unpredictable interference patterns capable of mimicking missile launches. Solar storms could blind satellites, weather inversions could bend radar beams, ionospheric disturbances could scatter signals, and atmospheric clutter could generate phantom returns. But none of those possibilities frightened them as much as one chilling thought. If the moon could almost trigger a nuclear launch, so could anything else. And the deeper ARPA's scientists dug, the more flaws they uncovered. Most of America's missile detection technologies were built with rigid assumptions about how the world behaved, and those assumptions were often dangerously wrong because they treated data as objective even when data could be distorted, and they treated computers as infallible even when computers simply mirrored human limitations inside silicon. The moon incident became a catalyst for a broader discovery that early warning systems were built to detect threats, not understand them, which meant that the only thing separating safety from annihilation was whether a handful of analysts noticed inconsistencies before automated systems locked the country into a path toward retaliation. And this realization led to a wave of secret briefings where ARPA scientists warned Pentagon leaders that the entire doctrine of nuclear deterrence rested on systems far less stable than politicians believed. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, completely unaware that the United States had nearly launched its arsenal over a misinterpreted radar return, was building its own detection network with similar limitations, fragile radars, unpredictable software, and political pressure to always assume the Americans would strike first. And while neither superpower realized it at the time, both sides were constructing machine-driven command structures that could misinterpret nature as nuclear war. This parallel evolution of flawed warning systems meant that at any moment, a random glitch in either country could have sparked global catastrophe, and historians would later uncover multiple Soviet near-launch incidents caused by sun glare, malfunctioning satellites, and faulty sensors, meaning humanity had been saved not by technology, but by exhausted officers who hesitated at the last second. But in 1960, the U.S. military was not ready to admit publicly how close it had come to disaster. Instead, senior officials quietly ordered upgrades to the radar network, new filtering algorithms, additional verification channels, and new training protocols encouraging skepticism. Though in practice, skepticism was hard to maintain because nuclear doctrine drilled into operators demanded immediate action, not thoughtful analysis. And anyone who hesitated too long risked being blamed for allowing a surprise attack. This pressure created what internal memos called the paradox of deterrence, the idea that operators had to believe an attack was always possible while simultaneously avoiding overreacting to false alarms. A psychological contradiction that placed unimaginable stress on the men responsible for interpreting radar screens. As weeks turned into months, the investigation finally produced its classified summary, System Misinterpretation Caused by Lunar Echo. But this short conclusion hid the true magnitude of the problem because what investigators didn't put in writing, but repeatedly stressed in closed-door briefings, was that political leaders needed to understand how fragile their nuclear shield really was. President Eisenhower, nearing the end of his term, was quietly briefed, and he reacted with a mix of fury and resignation, reportedly remarking that, "We have built machines faster than men can think," a warning he later echoed publicly in his farewell address, though without mentioning the near catastrophe. Eisenhower's frustration stemmed from a fundamental truth. The Pentagon had spent years selling the narrative of early warning perfection to Congress and the public, boasting that America possessed the most advanced detection capabilities in the world. Yet behind the scenes, those same systems were generating false alarms that could start World War III. And as the Cold War heated up, the number of false alarms increased, reinforcing fears that the technological race to detect Soviet launches was outpacing the ability of humans to interpret what the systems were actually seeing. Inside NORAD, senior planners pushed for a new doctrine requiring 3 independent confirmations before nuclear retaliation could be authorized. But this idea clashed with another doctrine pushed by strategic air command leaders like General Power, who believed that hesitation was unacceptable because a real Soviet strike could wipe out American missile silos in minutes. The two sides clashed repeatedly, with SAC insisting on rapid response and NORAD warning that rapid response based on unreliable sensors was suicidal. These internal battles became so heated that at one point, the Joint Chiefs debated whether the president should even have final authority in the event of a nuclear alert, since communication lines might be cut before he received confirmation, and some senior officers advocated for allowing regional commanders to launch without presidential approval in extreme circumstances. An idea Eisenhower rejected outright because it risked nuclear war being triggered by panic, paranoia, or misunderstanding. Yet the moon incident proved that a misunderstanding was all it took. And while the U.S. quietly strengthened its verification protocols, the public remained blissfully unaware that the country had nearly ended the world by accident. But the consequences of the moon false alarm went far beyond radar upgrades. It fundamentally reshaped the evolution of early warning technology, leading to the development of the MIDAS, Missile Defense Alarm System, satellites, infrared detectors that looked for the heat signatures of missile launches from space rather than relying solely on ground-based radar. These satellites were seen as a solution to the limitations exposed by the moon incident, though they too would later generate false alarms from sunlight reflecting off clouds. Nevertheless, the rush to deploy MADIS reflected a new fear spreading through military research circles, that ground-based radar alone could not be trusted to preserve civilization, and that multiple layers of verification were essential. But even as technological progress accelerated, one reality overshadowed all others. The Cold War nuclear standoff was becoming so complex, so automated, and so intertwined with machine logic that humanity was effectively handing control of global survival to systems that could, and sometimes did, misinterpret innocent natural phenomena as acts of war. And as the U.S. and USSR expanded their arsenals, increased their bomber fleets, and deployed thousands of missiles across the world, the chances of a catastrophic false alarm increased with them. Every new radar dish, every new satellite, every new command algorithm introduced more opportunities for errors. And while the moon incident was one of the earliest, it would not be the last. It was simply the first time the world came within minutes of an accidental Armageddon. The first moment where analysts realized that the machines meant to save them might instead kill them. As months passed, the moon incident slowly faded from official conversations inside NORAD and the Pentagon, buried beneath new crises, new intelligence estimates, and the relentless pace of Cold War escalation. Yet within certain scientific and military circles, the event became a whispered warning, a ghost that haunted every discussion about the future of nuclear command and control. Because those who had witnessed the false alarm firsthand could never shake the memory of how fragile the entire deterrent structure truly was. How easily a simple misinterpretation could have cascaded into global annihilation, and how terrifyingly close they had come to recommending a retaliatory launch based solely on the reflection of a radar beam off a celestial object. That sense of vulnerability deepened as new reports began coming in from other radar stations documenting smaller anomalies, unexplained spikes, transient echoes, false missile signatures, and occasional bursts of interference that the system struggled to categorize. And while none of these matched the magnitude of the moon incident, their frequency proved that early warning was not the clean, precise science the Pentagon had promised the nation, but rather a chaotic fight against noise, clutter, and ambiguity, where the stakes were nothing less than human survival. At the same time, intelligence analysts began raising another unsettling possibility. If American radar could misinterpret the moon as missiles, what about the Soviet Union's systems? Soviet technology lagged behind in sophistication, calibration, and algorithm design, and their command culture relied more heavily on rigid protocol and unquestioned obedience than on analytical skepticism, meaning a Soviet radar operator experiencing a similar anomaly might react with far less caution than the Americans did, incrementally raising the terrifying possibility that the world could be plunged into nuclear war not by U.S. error alone, but by a Soviet misreading of natural phenomena. This fear was not hypothetical. Intercepted documents and defectors later revealed that Soviet radar systems routinely suffered from severe false returns caused by atmospheric refraction, power surges, and even nearby forest fires. And because Soviet officers often feared punishment for questioning system outputs, they were more likely to trust faulty data. In Pentagon analysis rooms, this realization sparked a crisis of confidence not only in American systems, but in the entire global architecture of nuclear deterrence. Because deterrence did not require just American reliability, it required Soviet reliability too, and one wrong interpretation by either side could trigger the end of the world. Meanwhile, the pressure on America's early warning network grew as more and more missiles were deployed on both sides. New Soviet ICBM silos appeared deep in Siberia. New American Minuteman missiles were planted across the Great Plains, and both superpowers expanded their bomber fleets, meaning that the number of potential launch trajectories increased dramatically, placing even more burden on systems that were already struggling to distinguish between real threats and harmless echoes from the natural world. In late 1961, an internal NORAD simulation revealed another frightening discovery. If the moon incident had occurred during a period of high geopolitical tension, such as the Berlin crisis or the upcoming Cuban Missile Crisis, the political and military environment might have pressured commanders into assuming the worst, accelerating the timeline for retaliation and dramatically reducing the margin for analytical hesitation. In wartime posture, the same false alarm that had been caught and contained might instead have escalated uncontrollably. Analysts warned repeatedly that the United States could not rely on calmness as a safeguard. Human judgment worked only when humans had time and psychological space to think, and nuclear alerts by design eliminated both. The pressure to respond quickly, decisively, and overwhelmingly had been built into every layer of nuclear decision-making, and the moon incident demonstrated that those pressures could override cautious interpretation in a real crisis. Yet despite all this, the Cold War climate continued deteriorating. U.S. spy planes flew deeper into Soviet airspace, Soviet submarines patrolled closer to the American coast, and both sides accelerated the development of new weapon systems capable of striking with unprecedented speed. Every advancement made false alarms even more dangerous. Hypersonic speeds meant verification windows shrank. MIRV warheads meant radar signatures became more complex. New Soviet over-the-horizon radar meant their own systems would encounter the same atmospheric anomalies the U.S. struggled with. The world was becoming more interconnected, more automated, and far more vulnerable to catastrophic misinterpretation. Within the Pentagon, a growing number of scientists began pushing for what they called cognitive redundancy, the requirement that multiple independent verification methods must confirm an attack before nuclear retaliation could be authorized. But this idea repeatedly clashed with SAC's doctrine of overwhelming immediate response. SAC leaders argued that if the Soviets launched first, any delay could destroy America's nuclear arsenal on the ground. Their answer was always the same: speed was survival. But NORAD's response was equally uncompromising: speed without certainty was suicide. The moon incident forced these two philosophies into open conflict, and the intensity of the debate nearly erupted into institutional crisis. Eventually, a fragile compromise emerged: the creation of dual confirmation thresholds, meaning that radar alone could not trigger retaliation. Satellite verification was required as well, but even this safeguard was fragile. Early satellite technology was primitive, prone to glare, malfunction, and false readings. Engineers documented dozens of cases where sunlight reflecting off clouds produced signatures that resembled missile launches. In one classified incident years later, a Soviet satellite mistook the reflection of sunlight off high-altitude clouds for 5 incoming U.S. missiles. An error caught only because one Soviet officer refused to trust the computer. Unknown to the Americans at the time, the moon incident foreshadowed a future in which false alarms would become shockingly common, and every one of them risked becoming the spark for World War III. As these technological and doctrinal tensions escalated, political leaders began facing a second, equally terrifying reality. The public could never know any of this, revealing the truth that the United States multi-billion-dollar early warning system had once mistook the moon for an all-out Soviet nuclear attack, would undermine public confidence, destabilize deterrence narratives, and provide ammunition for anti-nuclear movements, gaining traction in Europe and the United States. Thus, the moon incident became deeply classified, hidden even from most of Congress, a secret of extraordinary significance, known only to a small circle of generals, scientists, and engineers. But suppressing knowledge did not solve the underlying problem. The world was entering a period of unprecedented nuclear danger, and both superpowers were building their early warning networks faster than they could understand the consequences. Meanwhile, the arms race continued accelerating. New missile fields expanded across continents, bomber patrol routes intensified, and each side deployed more warheads than the planet could ever hope to survive. The moon incident was a symptom, not the disease, a warning that technological complexity had outrun human control. And yet the world kept building, kept escalating, kept trusting machines to identify the beginning of the end. What nobody realized at the time was that the moon incident was only the first of several moments where global annihilation came within minutes of unfolding, moments where nature, error, or malfunction played with the machinery of Armageddon, and humanity escaped only through luck, hesitation, or the courage of a single skeptical officer. And the deeper NORAD dug into its systems, the more horrifying the truth became. The next false alarm might not be caught in time by the late 1960s, as both the United States and the Soviet Union continued pouring money, manpower, and political capital into expanding their nuclear arsenals. The shadow of the moon incident lingered behind every classified briefing, quietly shaping decisions, doctrines, and technological upgrades in ways the world would not understand for decades, because while the public and most politicians believed that nuclear annihilation would come only from intentional conflict, generals and scientists knew the darker truth, that an accidental war, triggered by a misunderstanding, a sensor failure, or a moment of machine confusion, was far more likely. And the more they studied the early warning systems of both nations, the more they realized how many times humanity had unknowingly balanced on the edge of oblivion, relying not on strategy or diplomacy, but on luck, timing, and a few human beings who refused to trust what the machines were showing them. As new classified reports accumulated, commanders discovered that the moon incident had not been an outlier at all. It had been the first in a long string of near catastrophes waiting to happen, each more terrifying than the last. Weather anomalies that mimicked missile launches, power failures that produced phantom radar signatures, computer chips that malfunctioned and generated fake Soviet attack alerts, and communication outages that temporarily severed links between command posts and early warning centers, any one of which could have escalated into irreversible retaliation under slightly different conditions. What alarmed officials most was that as nuclear technology advanced, warning times shrank. By the early 1970s, Soviet missiles could reach the U.S. in less than 20 minutes, and American missiles could strike Soviet territory even faster, meaning there was almost no time for deliberation, analysis, or human skepticism. Nuclear war had become a race between interpretation and annihilation, and the moon incident served as a reminder that machines often outran the humans meant to control them. In quiet corridors of the Pentagon, senior advisors began arguing that the world was entering a phase of accidental brinkmanship, where no rational leader on either side would choose nuclear war. Yet both nations could be dragged into it by systems that behaved unpredictably. The moon incident was used as Exhibit A in these arguments, proof that even a harmless object in the sky could be misread as an existential threat. Some generals pushed for more satellites, more radar redundancies, more complex software, but skeptics countered that each layer of technology introduced more points of failure, more complications, and more risk. The solution wasn't simply to expand the system, but to overhaul the philosophy behind it, to build detection networks designed not only to detect threats, but to recognize when the data made no sense. But this shift in thinking was slow, resisted by those who believed that admitting vulnerability would undermine deterrence. Meanwhile, smaller false alarms continued. weather balloons misread as missiles, training tapes accidentally inserted into live systems, computer processors overheating and spitting out nonsense, and radar beams bouncing off distant mountains into patterns that resembled incoming warheads. Again and again, human operators intervened at the last second, noticing inconsistencies that computers did not. And every time, classified memos circulated warning that the next false alarm might slip through the cracks. Behind closed doors, nuclear planners became increasingly convinced that the moon incident had exposed a flaw not just in machines, but in nuclear strategy itself. Deterrence required instant retaliation. Instant retaliation required instant interpretation, and instant interpretation meant trusting systems that could never be perfect. Some analysts began describing the global nuclear arsenal as a sleepwalker's gun, always loaded, always cocked, always ready to fire, and held by two nations waking up intermittently in panic and confusion. The moon incident became a symbol of this fragility, a reminder that even the calmest day could turn into the beginning of the end, simply because a radar beam caught the wrong reflection. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, a period historians later called the most dangerous phase of the entire Cold War, the stakes grew even higher. New Soviet systems, plagued with their own flaws and overseen by officers terrified of being blamed for failure, produced multiple false alerts, including the infamous 1983 incident where Soviet satellites misinterpreted sunlight reflections as 5 American missiles. And it was only because Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov refused to trust the computers that the world avoided nuclear retaliation. Unknown to Petrov, he was fighting the same battle General Cooter had faced decades earlier during the moon incident, the battle between machine certainty and human doubt. Both men had saved humanity by saying, "This data doesn't make sense." And yet their skepticism wasn't built into the system. It came from their own judgment, intuition, and willingness to pause when the world demanded they act instantly. As Cold War leaders aged and later reflected on the era, many admitted privately that the greatest threats had not been Soviet missiles, American bombers, or political tensions, but the possibility that a false alarm might be interpreted as a real one, triggering a retaliation that would spiral into global annihilation. Presidents, generals, and defense ministers later revealed chilling secrets that the U.S. had come close to retaliating several times because of sensor malfunctions, that communications outages had left missile crews isolated and confused, that weather events had fooled systems on both sides, and that, more than once, nuclear bombers had been launched into the sky because early warning centers believed an attack was underway. In each case, the pattern repeated: a moment of confusion, a machine insisting the world was ending, and a human being deciding whether to believe it. And through all of these near misses, the moon incident remained the earliest and clearest warning of a flaw that would continue haunting the nuclear age. The fact that civilization relied on imperfect systems interpreting a chaotic, unpredictable world through the narrow lens of wartime logic. Eventually, as the Cold War wound down and classified archives began to open, historians pieced together the truth. The moon incident was more than a glitch, more than a technical error. It was a symbol of the entire nuclear era's precariousness, proof that the apocalypse could begin not with a missile launch, not with political tension, but with something as simple and innocent as a radar pulse bouncing off the surface of the moon. And even after the Soviet Union collapsed and the world breathed a sigh of relief, military analysts quietly warned that the underlying danger had never disappeared. Modern systems were faster, more automated, and more complex than ever, meaning that future false alarms could spread through command networks in milliseconds, overwhelming human judgment even faster than before. The moon incident stood as a timeless reminder that deterrence based on speed, automation, and instant retaliation was inherently unstable, and that humanity's survival depended not on machines, but on the rare individuals willing to question them. In the end, the story of the moon incident is not simply a tale of Cold War paranoia. It is a warning about the limits of human control in a world governed by fast, fragile, and unforgiving systems. It is a story of how the rise of automation nearly triggered a nuclear apocalypse, how a harmless celestial body was briefly mistaken for Armageddon, and how civilization survived only because, on that day in 1960, one analyst looked at the data, trusted his instincts over the machines, and said the quiet words that saved the world: "This doesn't look right."